Hi everyone, and welcome to CIRA's online learning modules for landlords. We hope that these sessions will help you understand your obligations under the Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act, and we will also direct you to where you can learn more. In addition to these online learning modules, there is a comprehensive guide that is available on our website in two places, under the Information for Landlords tab and under our Resources tab. Today, an estimated 1 in 5 Canadians report having a disability, and the number of Ontarians living with disabilities is expected to rise in the years to come. As Ontario's population ages, accessibility will become more prevalent. Before we get started today, I'll introduce myself and CIRA. My name is Alyssa Brierly. I'm the Executive Director and General Counsel here at the Centre for Equality Rights in Accommodation, also known as CIRA. And I'm here today with Carly Bowie, our Project Coordinator. For those who are not familiar with CIRA, we're a charitable organization that works to advance housing rights in Ontario. We do this by providing direct service to renters in Ontario facing eviction or human rights barriers in their housing, by doing some litigation work, and by providing public education sessions like this one. We know that housing providers are faced with the complex challenge of adhering to municipal and provincial laws and responding to the diverse needs of their renters. The purpose of this webinar series is to help clarify your requirements under the AODA. It also covers how the AODA works with other legislation and offers useful tips on how to ensure that your business practices promote accessibility. The first 3 modules will cover your obligations under the AODA and explain how it works with other legislation. Our 4th module will cover frequently asked questions about the AODA. Before we begin, we would like to acknowledge that these webinars were made possible by funding received through an Enabling Change partnership project with the Government of Ontario, and we are very grateful for their support. And before we start, a quick disclaimer. This webinar and the accompanying guide are intended to provide general information about your accessibility obligations. It is not legal advice, nor is it intended to substitute for legal advice. For information or questions about your specific situation, please consult a lawyer.
In this module, we will cover a brief introduction to the AODA and the Integrated Accessibility Standards Regulation, including general requirements. We will also cover the Customer Service Standard, covering issues such as creating your customer service policies and specifics around certain topics such as service animals, support persons, and staff training.
The Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act, shortened to the AODA, became law in 2005. The AODA helps obligated businesses and organizations to identify, remove, and prevent barriers for people with disabilities. The Government of Ontario has developed accessibility standards under the AODA. These are found in the Integrated Accessibility Standards Regulation, shortened to the IASR. These standards are legal rules that will help Ontario businesses become more accessible and help Ontario reach its accessibility goal. The IASR was updated in 2016, and this guide reflects those changes as of the date of publication. Ontario's accessibility standards require housing providers to think about barriers that may be created by the way that they interact with, communicate with, and provide services to their renters. The accessibility standards encourage housing providers to proactively take steps to overcome these barriers and increase accessibility for renters with disabilities. Housing providers will find that being compliant with these standards will help foster stronger relationships with their renters, which is important in being a successful housing provider.
It is important to keep in mind that the definition of disability is not static. It is constantly evolving, and the responsibility of housing providers will evolve with it. As our population ages, more people will develop disabilities. Additionally, our understanding of disability is becoming more nuanced as people become more comfortable discussing their issues and seeking appropriate treatment. Seeing someone wearing glasses is commonplace today. However, it is an example of how an assistive device helps someone overcome their disability to participate in everyday life. There is a wide range of cognitive and mental health considerations to be made. Additionally, the stigma of discussing mental health may be a barrier for your clients and/or your employees. Physical impairments can be temporary or permanent. It is not always obvious that someone is living with a disability. Invisible disabilities can include mental illness, brain injury, chronic pain, visual or auditory disabilities, and learning disabilities. The definition of disability can be found in the AODA.
Invisible disabilities may not be immediately noticeable. They can include mental health disabilities, brain injury, chronic pain, visual or auditory disabilities, intellectual disabilities, and learning disabilities. There are a number of common barriers that may impact renters with invisible disabilities. The use of scented products, including paint, cleaning agents, and air fresheners in common areas of residential complexes may be a barrier. Renters who live with certain types of disabilities, such as environmental sensitivities, may experience symptoms when exposed to air contaminants, such as scented products. They may require the use of unscented products and scent-free laundry facilities, for example. Noise from adjoining and nearby apartments may also be a barrier. Renters who live with certain types of invisible disabilities, such as post-traumatic stress disorder, may experience symptoms triggered by noises that originate in other units in the building. These renters may require soundproofing of their units, for example. Inflexible customer service and communication policies in the building may also be a barrier. Renters living with certain types of invisible disabilities, including visual impairment and mental illness, may experience challenges receiving building notices, remembering to pay their rent on time, or reporting issues to building management in line with standard building policy or practice. These renters may require alternative ways of completing these tasks. Unit entry by the housing provider or an employee of the housing provider for routine inspections may also be a barrier to some renters. Individuals living with certain types of invisible disabilities, including mental illness, may require that special conditions be put in place before the housing provider may enter their unit. For example, a renter may require more than the standard notice period for entry. So you might be wondering, who must comply with the AODA? All organizations with at least one employee in Ontario have obligations under the AODA. All sectors have to comply with AODA standards. The AODA has different compliance obligations depending on the size of the organization. Small organizations are defined as having from 1 to 49 employees. Large organizations have 50 or more employees. When counting the number of employees in your organization, you should include full-time, part-time, and seasonal employees. You do not have to include volunteers and independent contractors in your total. However, you will need to train your volunteers or any contractors who will be developing policies for your organization. A housing provider who is self-employed, either as a sole proprietor or in a partnership, is not considered an employee. A housing provider who runs their own incorporated business may be considered an employee of the corporation. Please get legal advice if you are not sure whether you are an employee or whether you have employees. It's important for housing providers to fully understand the standards and their requirements. These requirements impact how housing providers should interact with, communicate with, and provide services to their renters. In addition, while some requirements only apply to large organizations, when small organizations also follow these rules, they will provide greater accessible services to their tenants.
The benefit of accessibility retrofits is that they tend to benefit more people than originally planned for. The Stopgap Community Ramp Project has been successful at highlighting how a simple ramp can make life easier for everyone. Participants have shared that a ramp storefront is more inviting. Parents pushing strollers, couriers using carts to handle heavy packages, and people using mobility aids all benefit from a barrier-free storefront. LCD screens and stop announcements on the TTC also help everyone taking the TTC to find their way. Ontario's accessibility standards require businesses to meet criteria in several areas that are important to people with disabilities. These include how organizations provide customer service to people with disabilities, how organizations provide information and communicate with people with disabilities, how organizations must incorporate accessibility into their employment practices, how public transit organizations must address ways to prevent and remove barriers to public transportation to be more accessible to people with disabilities, and how new or redeveloped public spaces must be designed to be more accessible for people with disabilities. As of July 2016, there are 5 accessibility standards grouped into one regulation called the Integrated Accessibility Standards Regulation, IASR. The 5 standards include customer service, information and communication, and the design of public spaces. The 2 that won't be covered in these trainings are employment and transportation.
Each standard has specific requirements. Some requirements apply only to large organizations. Again, these with 50 or more employees. Others apply to both large and small organizations. Again, those with 1 to 49 employees. Housing providers that meet these standards will build stronger relationships with their renters and will also be less likely to receive a formal human rights complaint. The AODA allows the Government of Ontario to enforce the accessibility standards. The government can conduct audits, issue compliance orders, and order monetary penalties for non-compliance with the standards. The AODA allows for significant penalties if an organization is found guilty of an offense under the Act. This includes financial penalties for each day on which an offense occurs, depending on the size and type of the organization's compliance history, and the impact of the violation. While the government does have this enforcement authority, they have to date taken a more positive approach to helping housing providers comply by offering training, education, and resources. The best place for seeking additional information, education, and resources is www.ontario.ca/accessibility. There are a number of general requirements under the IASR which do not relate to a specific standard. These general requirements include developing, implementing, and maintaining accessibility policies, establishing, implementing, and maintaining accessibility plans, training staff, volunteers, contract workers, and others, considering accessibility features when designing, procuring, or acquiring self-service kiosks, and reporting on compliance online. Please refer to the guide to review these general requirements in more detail. We'll now move to the customer service standard.
The customer service standard helps housing providers deliver service in a way that takes into account the needs of people with disabilities. Accessible customer service will only become more important as the population ages and the number of people with disabilities increases. Organizations are required to develop and document customer service policies, allow service animals, welcome support persons, provide notice of temporary disruptions of services or facilities, train staff, contract workers, and others, establish a process for receiving and responding to feedback, consider a person's disability when communicating with them.
All private sector, nonprofit, and public housing providers with one or more employees must develop, implement, and maintain policies for providing goods, services, and facilities to persons with disabilities. Please note that these policies must address the use of assistive devices, such as oxygen tanks and walkers. The policies should be consistent with the principles of dignity, independence, integration, and equality of opportunity, and must address potential barriers that renters with disabilities might face in accessing service. These policies must also clearly state that the housing provider will communicate with a person with a disability in a way that takes their disability into account. All private sector, nonprofit, and public housing providers with 50 or more employees must put their customer service policies in writing and make them available to the public by posting them on their website or Facebook page, for example. If requested, they are also required to provide this document in an accessible format.
All private sector, nonprofit, and public housing providers with one or more employees must allow service animals onto all areas of the residential complex that are open to the public. Sometimes laws may exclude animals. Those laws include the Health Protection and Promotion Act and the Food Safety and Quality Act, which exclude animals from area where food is prepared. Also, some municipalities have bylaws restricting certain breeds of dogs or other animals. If a renter's service animal is excluded by law from an area of the residential complex, then housing providers must ensure that there are alternative measures to provide service to the renter. One way to do this is to provide service to the renter in an area of the residential complex where the service animal is allowed. A service animal is not a pet. He or she is a working animal and must not be excluded. Housing providers are not to ask what disability the service animal is being used for. Service animals cannot be denied from entering the building or person's unit even if the person with the disability requiring a service animal is not the renter. It may be a visitor of the building or a prospective renter. All private sector, nonprofit, and public housing providers with one or more employees must allow renters support persons onto all areas of the residential complex that are open to the public. A support person is someone who assists a person with a disability with daily tasks. Housing providers need to identify how they will deal with special situations and identify any possible situations when a support person might be required to accompany a person with a disability for health or safety reasons. Housing providers are also required to consult with people with disabilities to understand their needs. This means they have to examine all health and safety considerations and determine if there are further ways to protect people with disabilities while on the residential premise. These requirements apply for renters, prospective renters, and visitors.
All private sector, nonprofit, and public housing providers with one or more employees must inform people with disabilities when services or facilities they usually use will be temporarily unavailable. This could include hot water being shut off for a period of time or elevators being taken out of service. Examples of an unavailable facility may include the loss of access to common areas of the building, such as the shared laundry room or parking garage. The notice should include information about the reason for the disruption, how long the disruption is expected to last, and a description of alternative facilities or services, if any are available. Notice can be given by posting the information in an obvious location in the residential complex and on the housing provider's website, as well as additional communications platforms employed by the housing provider, such as a social media page. All private sector, nonprofit, and public housing providers with 50 or more employees must also prepare a document that details the steps that they will take if there is a temporary disruption of services or facilities. This document must be provided in an accessible format to anyone who requests it. All private sector, nonprofit, and public housing providers with one or more employees are required to provide training on accessible customer service to persons with disabilities. This training must be provided to all employees and volunteers who interact with renters, including paid and unpaid positions, full-time, part-time, and contract positions, as well as anyone who is involved in developing the organization's policies. For third-party organizations that provide services, such as facilities management companies, the organization may provide training, or the third party can do their own training. However, it is the housing provider's responsibility to ensure the training takes place, whether completed by the housing provider itself or the third party. All new employees and volunteers need to receive training as soon as possible once they begin working with a housing provider. This training must be provided whenever your organization's customer service policies change, or when an employee's or volunteer's duties change. Free training modules can be found at https://accessforward.ca. All private sector, nonprofit, and public housing providers with 50 or more employees must maintain training records, including when the training was delivered and how many people participated in the training. The content of the training must include the purposes of the AODA and the requirements of the customer service standard, the housing provider's accessible customer service policies, how to interact with people with different types of disabilities, how to interact with people with disabilities who use an assistive device or require the assistance of a guide dog or other service animal, or the assistance of a support person, how to use accessibility devices, if any, that are offered in the residential complex, and what to do if a renter with a disability is having difficulty accessing services or facing an accessibility barrier.
All private sector, nonprofit, and public housing providers with one or more employees must establish and make available a method for renters who have disabilities to provide feedback on their experience receiving accessible customer service. Also, there has to be an established process for responding to the feedback, including complaints. If there are additional feedback processes in place, housing providers must make them accessible to people with disabilities upon request. Additional processes must be made in an accessible format, including providing communication supports if asked. For example, if a renter with a speech impairment cannot provide feedback by speaking directly with the housing provider, then there must be another method for the person to give their feedback. An alternative may be providing a written feedback form. A person with a disability has the right to have their housing provider communicate with them in a way that considers their disability. The housing provider must consult with the person to determine what format or communication support would be appropriate. The way you provide services must meet the needs of the renter. An example of this is someone with vision loss may not be able to read written notices. You may need to send them in an accessible PDF that can be accessed through screen reader technology.
The best way to achieve accessible customer service is to have open communication. Housing providers and renters that have an honest and inclusive dialogue are the most likely to find the accessibility solutions that work for both sides. Keep the following principles in mind when communicating with renters. Dignity. It is important to provide service in a way that allows renters with disabilities to maintain self-respect and dignity. This can best be achieved by communicating with renters individually to understand their needs, understanding and contemplating the many ways that people need to access services, and providing the services in a way that ensures that the renter feels valued and deserving of full service. Independence. People living with disabilities most often wish to access services independently. This allows them to do things in their own way. Open communication will help housing providers discover how renters with disabilities wish to receive and access services. Integration. Renters with disabilities should be able to access services in a way that allows them to benefit from the same services in the same place and in a similar way as other renters. The goal should be to create an environment where landlords' customer service policies and practices promote integration and full participation. And finally, equal or equitable opportunity. Renters with disabilities should have the same opportunity to access services and at the same quality as others. They should not have to make significantly more effort or have to deal with more inconvenience than other renters.
So next week we are going to talk about information and communication standards and the design of public spaces. So please join us at the same time, 12 o'clock.
Are there any questions? If not, we look forward to joining you next week, and we will leave you with a couple of slides of resources that can help you understand your obligations